According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, fish make up 50% of animal protein intake globally. With increasing global populations and the threat of climate change, there is need for more efficient protein production. The largest production occurs in Asia and Southeast Asia, with China accounting for 16% of global production. At the same time, wild fishery stocks are collapsing due to overharvesting and habitat loss. This has spurred rapid development of aquaculture to meet the global demands. Here we have a quote by Jacques Cousteau. "We must plant the sea and herd its animals using the sea as farmers instead of hunters." That is what civilization is all about, farming replacing hunting. If conservation is your goal, this idea makes sense. Could you imagine what would happen if we got rid of farming pigs, chickens, and cattle, and went back to hunting deer and rabbits? We would cause mass extinctions of the local wildlife very quickly. Aquaculture is mostly used to raise fish for human consumption. However, there are other uses. Game fish are raised for the sports fishing industry, and exotic fish are raised for hobby aquarists. Aquaculture is also useful in alleviating the demands in the exotic animal trade. Seahorses are normally harvested from the wild to be used as exotic pets and in traditional Chinese medicine. This has caused massive declines in seahorse populations. Aquaculture can be divided into two main categories: extensive aquaculture and intensive aquaculture. Extensive aquaculture is characterized by a low to moderate stocking density. Typically, you would use a large enclosure to raise a monoculture or a polyculture, meaning you would raise a single species or multiple different species within the same enclosure. Generally, the species you choose in extensive aquaculture are hardy, like carp or tilapia. These fish produce a good quality product, however, they're raised in mixed age groups, so you'll end up with variable sizes. Extensive aquaculture relies on basic management, so you don't have a whole lot of control over the environment. Seeing as how you're dependent on the inherent conditions, proper site selection is important, and that means assessing water quality, temperature, water chemistry, water flow, and weather. Unfavorable conditions will affect growth, the availability of food, and the prevalence of disease. The image on the right is an example of extensive aquaculture, where they've combined a rice paddy with a carp farm. In regard to management, systems for water treatment may be necessary. For example, you may need additional aeration. Natural feeding is usually sufficient, with supplemental feeding at higher densities. Fertilizers can be used to enhance natural productivity. Pesticides can also be used at higher densities. Some of the environmental issues associated with extensive aquaculture include the destruction of natural habitats to make room for the operation. Effluents from aquaculture facilities can also damage the surrounding environment. For example, coastal ponds are known to damage the surrounding mangrove forests. Aeration is used to artificially increase the level of dissolved oxygen in the aquatic environment. There are different methods of aeration. The most basic means of aeration is via the pond fountain, which aerosolizes water droplets to increase the surface area where the water is in contact with the atmosphere. This increases dissolved oxygen while releasing carbon dioxide and nitrogen. However, with pond fountains, the aeration is limited to the pond surface. Air stones and bubblers pump atmospheric air through a porous stone or a porous hose. These tiny bubbles are injected into the water column, and that increases the level of dissolved oxygen. The rising bubbles can also disrupt the water column to prevent stratification. As previously mentioned, stratification can be an issue in stagnant lakes and ponds. Other methods of aeration include paddle wheel aerators and aspirator aerators. Paddle wheel aerators splash along the surface of the water. This increases dissolved oxygen and releases carbon dioxide and nitrogen, just like the pond fountain. It also generates a current to distribute the oxygenated water and to prevent stratification. With the aspirator aerators, there is a propeller underwater which creates a vacuum. This draws air through an intake and injects it into the water column. This also generates an angled current to distribute the oxygenated water and to prevent stratification. Extensive aquaculture is used in freshwater, brackish water, and marine environments. In the freshwater environment, you tend to see pond aquaculture and cages and net pens. These are used to raise tilapia, catfish, and carp, among other species. In brackish water, they tend to use coastal ponds to raise milkfish and tilapia. In the marine environment, they use cages and net pens. Examples of species raised in these systems include sea bass and pompano. Pond aquaculture is common in developing nations. These are natural or artificial basins that can contain freshwater or brackish water. The water tends to be shallow, up to a meter in depth, and the fish are bred and reared on site. Site selection in pond aquaculture is really important. Things you have to consider include water quality, water availability, accessibility, elevation, vegetation, the amount of shade, soil composition, and soil chemistry. Water exchange is very important in managing pond cultures. The reason for this is that the water is mostly stagnant. Stagnant water means that there's a lower oxygen content, a buildup of wastes, and increased salinity in the summer as the water evaporates away. For water exchange, you can use natural water sources. This can improve dissolved oxygen and water quality. Examples of freshwater sources include streams. For brackish water, you can use tidal flow. So during low tide, the pond is drained. During high tide, the water is replenished. Groundwater sources will improve water quality. However, as previously mentioned, groundwater tends to be low in dissolved oxygen, so this won't help in terms of oxygenation. Supplemental oxygenation may be required. During periods of increased demand, pumps may be necessary. Examples would include an increase in the ambient temperature, in which case we would expect to see increased evaporation, a decrease in the solubility of oxygen, and an increase in the metabolic rate, resulting in an increase in oxygen demand. Another example is near harvest, where you're dealing with larger fish that require more oxygen as a whole and produce more waste. The wastes promote bacterial growth and decomposition, which are also oxygen dependent. The design of the pond can really help with water exchange. There are a number of systems that rely on separate canals for water intake and water discharge. This allows for better exchange, and it also prevents cross-contamination between ponds via one-way flow. A series of dikes and gates can be used to separate the various compartments and canals. In the image below, you can see an example of how this would work. So from the water intake canal, the water would flow into the nursery pond, where we would have fish that are in the early stages of development. These fish are kept separate so as to avoid intraspecific competition and predation. The water would then drain into the transition pond, which would have slightly larger fish, and then into the rearing pond, which would contain the adult fish, before leaving the system via the water drainage canal. For pond aquaculture, the soil also has to be treated. There are different ways of treating the soil. Drying and tilling kills undesirable species like parasites, pests, intermediate hosts, and predators. It also oxidizes undesirable compounds by exposing them to the atmosphere and the sun. By tilling the soil, you can also release nutrients that are buried deep underground. Flushing and leaching is when you drain the pond and hose it down with fresh water. This removes metals like iron and aluminum. It can also remove acidic compounds. Liming is when you deposit large amounts of calcium carbonate, calcium oxide, and calcium hydroxide into the soil. This is used to treat acidic soils by raising the pH and acting like a buffer. It also kills parasites and enhances bacterial decomposition and nitrification, which is a calcium-dependent process. The lime also precipitates suspended particles within the water column, which increases water clarity. Some of the issues associated with pond aquaculture include flooding. This can result in a loss of crop, which can be a huge financial loss to the producer. In some cases, it can also result in the escape of an invasive species of fish. In regards to human health risks, there are a number of infectious diseases associated with pond aquaculture, like schistosomiasis. The image on the bottom right is an example of a hypersensitivity reaction in the skin caused by the cercaria of a schistosome. Other human health risks include chemical contaminants like antibiotics, wastewater, which is often used as a fertilizer, and heavy metals like mercury, copper, and arsenic. Other issues associated with pond aquaculture include discharge and effluents, which can damage nearby environments. Cage and net pen aquaculture is higher in productivity, and so high-quality supplemental feed is often required. This is a low-cost and low-technology alternative, so it's accessible to families of low socioeconomic status. Cages and net pens are fairly versatile and can be used in lakes, oceans, rivers, and estuaries. They can vary from fixed structures, which are placed in shallow waters, or floating structures, which allow you to raise fish in deeper waters. The preferred species for cage and net pen aquaculture are those that grow well in confinement at higher densities. They tend to be hardy and resistant to disease, and they also tend to be species that have a ready supply of seed for stocking. For marine and brackish waters, species that are commonly used include grouper, sea bass, snapper, and milkfish. For freshwater habitats, examples of species that are used include tilapia, carp, snakehead, catfish, and trout. For cage and net pen aquaculture, site selection is really important. First, you have to decide whether you want a lentic environment or a lotic environment. Lentic meaning still water, and lotic meaning flowing water. Your choice will often depend on the species you're trying to rear. The site should also have favorable conditions as far as water chemistry and water temperature, the latter of which will also depend on the species you're trying to rear. You'll also have to be cognizant of winds, currents, and rough seas. If you can't avoid them, you can always fight them with deflectors and breakwaters. If you're using a fixed pen, you'll want to build it on a fixed substrate so that it doesn't break away. Pollution is another factor you'll want to consider, so make sure the pen is away from agricultural runoff, industrial effluents, domestic effluents, and mine tailings. Environmental issues will vary depending on the body of water. If you're dealing with a lake, concerns include stratification, turnover, soil chemistry, and algal blooms. If you're dealing with a river, you'll have to be aware of sources of pollution upstream and the amount of particulates suspended in the water column. If you're in the marine environment, you'll have to make sure there is sufficient tidal exchange. You should also be aware of any algal blooms in the area. Managing cage and net pens is fairly straightforward. Given that there's free exchange of water, there is no need for pumps. Aeration, however, may be required, especially if you're dealing with sills and slack tides. Floating pens can be relocated to more favorable conditions, and harvest is relatively simple since the fish are already in a net. Tides occur as a result of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. The effect is greatest when the sun and the moon are on the opposite sides of the Earth, where they engage in a sort of tug-of-war with the Earth's oceans. This is known as the spring tide. When the sun and the moon are perpendicular to one another relative to the Earth, this is known as the neap tide. Generally speaking, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a day, or more specifically, every 24 hours and 50 minutes. During high tide and low tide, there is little exchange of water. The flow velocity is low and about to change direction. This is referred to as a slack tide, and it's a period where the fish are most vulnerable to hypoxia. Water exchange is greatest between high tide and low tide, where the flow velocity is high. This is better known as the flood tide and the ebb tide, depending on the direction of flow. Sills are geological barriers at the mouth of the fjord which limit the free exchange of water. The lack of exchange is exacerbated when tidal flow is low. There are a number of issues with cage and net pen aquaculture. Firstly, there tends to be an accumulation of organic wastes around the pen. This can include feces and waste feed. There's also an accumulation of antibiotic residues in the surrounding environment, given that fish are often treated with in-feed antibiotics. Waste feed can also attract wild fish. Although this is beneficial in some regards because it reduces the amount of organic waste on the ocean floor, it also increases interspecies interactions, which increases the likelihood of disease transmission. Net fouling is a common problem in the marine environment, where other organisms like anemones and algae start to grow on the net. This causes increased weight and drag on the net, which will eventually result in the collapse of the pen if there's a strong enough current. It also limits water exchange through the net, which can result in hypoxia. The organisms that grow on the net also create new ecosystems which attract wild fish, and again, this increases interspecies interaction and increases the risk of disease transmission. Other issues associated with cage and net pen aquaculture include interspecies competition between wild fish and farmed fish, so smaller fish are able to swim through the netting and consume a portion of the feed. If these fish linger too long, they can outgrow the netting, which means that they'll get stuck within the pen and will end up as bycatch. Fish escapes are also more likely with cage and net pens, especially if there's damage to the netting. As a result, this setup requires constant maintenance. Other issues include predation, given that there's very little to separate the farmed fish from the surrounding environment. As a result, predator control measures are often employed. Intensive aquaculture is characterized by a higher stocking density and much more efficient production. Typically, they use smaller enclosures that use highly engineered systems and advanced technology. Intensive aquaculture is generally a monoculture, so you end up with a high-quality product which is uniform in size. In order for intensive aquaculture to be successful, you need species-specific knowledge, which may include knowledge on optimal temperature, optimal density, nutrition, and infectious diseases. Intensive aquaculture requires intensive management, which means there are higher labor costs. However, there is also a higher level of environmental control. In regards to managing intensive aquaculture, water treatment is often necessary. Examples would include aeration. You need regular feeding of high-quality feed and variable use of pesticides, antibiotics, and disinfectants. There are a number of environmental issues associated with intensive aquaculture. First of all, there's a high level of organic waste production, which can include feces and waste feed. This can result in eutrophication. Aquaponics can offset the negative environmental impacts by taking nutrient-rich effluents and using them in hydroponic farming. However, the success of this system is limited to small-scale operations. Intensive aquaculture uses a variety of enclosure types, like open net pens for freshwater and marine habitats, and land-based systems, including raceways for freshwater aquaculture, and closed containment recirculating systems for freshwater and marine aquaculture. Intensive open net pen aquaculture is similar to extensive cage and net pen aquaculture, but on a larger scale. The carbon footprint and the cost of construction and production are relatively low, as they use basic facilities and there's no need to pump water. In regards to management, there's free exchange of water, which means that management is less demanding. However, there's limited environmental control, which is why site selection is critical. Aeration may be necessary, particularly during a slack tide. Issues of open net pens include a greater impact on the environment, given that there is a free exchange of parasites and pathogens, and there's an accumulation of organic wastes. There's also an accumulation of chemicals used in treatment. In regard to fish escapes, the significance is dependent on the species to be reared and the location of the farm. Now, in general, there's a risk of introducing foreign species. This can result in the destabilization of the local ecosystem. It can also result in interspecies competition for resources, a higher risk of disease transmission, and in some cases, interbreeding with the native species. In the case of farmed Atlantic salmon, although fish escapes are associated with an increased risk of disease transmission, recovered salmon have empty stomachs. It seems as though farmed Atlantic salmon are accustomed to pelleted feed and make for lousy hunters, so the risk of interspecies competition for resources is low. Furthermore, over the last century, more than 8 million Atlantic salmon have been intentionally released into various lakes and rivers throughout British Columbia. Thus far, they have never been able to establish a breeding population, so the risk of interbreeding or significant long-term destabilization of the local ecosystem is low. Preventative measures include proper maintenance, minimizing net fouling, protection from rough weather, fire safety and emergency response, the control of ship traffic, and predator control. Now, in regards to organic wastes, a small amount of organic waste will feed the pelagic and benthic organisms in the surrounding environment. Excess production of organic wastes, including feces and waste feed, is more likely to occur during peak production. An accumulation of organic wastes on the ocean floor will result in a proliferation of aerobic bacteria. This will result in oxygen depletion. This is followed by the death of burrowing macrofauna, which in turn will result in a decreased turnover of the sediment. This in turn will cause rapid development of anoxia. Anoxic conditions favor the proliferation of anaerobic bacteria, which in turn release methane and hydrogen sulfide. The anoxic conditions and the hydrogen sulfide will result in death of benthic organisms like crustaceans and echinoderms. This will alter the ecosystem, and so pelagic species which are dependent on the benthic ecosystem will also be affected. Now in Canada, the ocean floor is monitored for signs of excess organic waste. Now in soft bottom environments, underwater cameras are used to check to see if the seafloor is barren. They also check to see if there's an accumulation of flocculent matter. In hard bottom environments, they look for indicator species like Beggiatoa and Ophryotrocha cyclops. Beggiatoa is a filamentous bacteria that synthesizes carbohydrates from water and carbon dioxide. It takes energy from inorganic compounds, specifically the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, so it's an indicator of elevated sulfide levels. Ophryotrocha cyclops produce opportunistic polychaete complexes. These may or may not be present when oxygen levels drop too low. The image on the bottom is that of Ophryotrocha cyclops. Now, polychaetes are segmented worms of the group Annelida, which also includes oligochaetes, like the earthworm. The image above is a microscopic image of Beggiatoa, the filamentous bacteria. These form white fuzzy mats on the ocean floor. Farrowing is the process by which a fish farm is removed from the area to give the surrounding environment time to recover. As previously mentioned, predation can be a problem with open net pens. Pinnipeds are so strong that they can push through perimeter nets and grab fish through the main netting. Eagles can grab fish from the surface. Cormorants can actually dive underwater and grab fish from below. Now, there are a number of issues associated with predation. Some of the predators can become entangled in the net and drown. Other predators can damage the netting, resulting in fish escapes. There are various methods of predator control. As previously mentioned, perimeter netting can be used to deter pinnipeds. However, in order for this to be effective, the perimeter netting has to be durable and heavy. Perimeter nets are often made from high-density polyethylene. They also have a stainless steel core, which is heavy and inflexible. Lightweight surface netting can be used to deter birds. Other methods of predator control include acoustic deterrence and electrified baitfish, which give sea lions a bit of a shock if they take the bait. Sea lions, being intelligent animals, often learn from this experience and are deterred from future attempts. Integrated multi-trophic aquaculture is a theoretical means of mitigating some of the environmental impacts of open net pen salmon farming. Now, as we all know, open net pens release large amounts of organic wastes into the surrounding environment. So the idea is that you farm other plants and animals in the area to remove some of these wastes. The inorganic compounds would be extracted by plants. the organic compounds would be extracted by sea cucumbers and other filter-feeding organisms like bivalves. The plants would release oxygen, which would supply the farm, and the filter feeders would be used to feed the fish. There are other environmentally friendly alternatives to open net pens that are currently in development, including the floating closed containment system. Now, with the floating closed containment system, investment and operation costs are intermediate, so it's still a bit expensive. Now, the water is only pumped a short distance, however, it does require a lot of maintenance and supplemental oxygen. Water intake is combined with an ultraviolet filter, which can kill lice, bacteria, algae, and viruses, and the water is drawn from the depths, which means it's free of planktonic species like Chaetoceros and salmon lice. Now, the wastes are broken apart and dispersed over a large area, so this would mitigate the environmental impact directly below the pen. With further development, there is potential for the wastes to be collected and transported for additional processing. These treated wastes can then be used as a fertilizer. Now, with closed containment systems, supplemental aeration is more efficient. With open net pens, any sort of supplemental oxygen you put into the pen is just carried away with the current. There are two types of floating closed containment systems currently in development: systems with rigid walls and systems with flexible composite walls. Now, with rigid wall systems, there's a greater risk of fish escapes with strong tidal currents and rough seas. Systems with flexible composite walls have a lower risk of fish escapes. These are generally built with heavy gauge polyvinyl chloride. Raceways are a land-based system of freshwater aquaculture. They use natural water sources like lakes, streams, and rivers that are diverted into a series of concrete channels. The system is gravity-fed, so it has a low carbon footprint. There's a high rate of water exchange, and fish escape is unlikely. In terms of management, aeration is generally achieved via a cascading pattern of water flow. Supplemental oxygen may be provided as needed. Now, one of the issues associated with raceway aquaculture is waste production. Wastewater is discharged directly into the environment. However, wastewater can be filtered and treated. Recirculating systems are a whole other kettle of fish. One of the advantages of recirculating systems is that they're very efficient in their use of water, which is very useful for when water is scarce. It's also easier to treat a lower volume of water. Now, most species of fish can be cultured in recirculating systems. There's also a lower risk to the environment, given that fish can't escape, there's no predation, and there's minimal risk of disease transmission. In regards to management, there's a high level of environmental control. This allows for year-round production. You can also achieve optimal conditions for the species you intend to rear. That being said, recirculation systems are high maintenance and labor intensive. Because of this, any failure in the system will result in a mass mortality event. Supplemental aeration is necessary, and it requires physical, chemical, and biological wastewater treatment. Now, some of the issues associated with recirculating systems include high investment. The profitability is species dependent. At present, salmon production is not profitable. There's also the issue of high energy costs. It takes a lot of energy to pump water, so this system has a large carbon footprint. Other issues include the buildup of nitrogenous wastes, which necessitates the periodic exchange of water. With recirculating systems, there's also high levels of organic waste production. The system produces highly concentrated effluents which have to be treated and disposed of. This is very costly, especially when you're dealing with larger fish. The use of recirculating systems is more feasible when you're rearing ornamental fish or salmon during their early life stages. Some of the other challenges associated with recirculating systems is in the maintenance of the biological filter. Low dissolved oxygen results in a proliferation of anaerobic bacteria and a loss of nitrifying bacteria. This leads to toxin production, specifically hydrogen sulfide, which in turn results in decreased nitrification, which is very sensitive to sulfides. In anaerobic environments, you also get nitrogen production, which increases the likelihood of supersaturation. This can lead to gas bubble disease. Within recirculating systems, there's also an accumulation of sludge. As previously mentioned, the sludge can be anaerobic, and allowing for the proliferation of anaerobic bacteria. If the system is stirred, it can break apart this debris and release a large amount of hydrogen sulfide into circulation. This can result in elevated mortality. Although fish are less likely to acquire infectious diseases from wildlife reservoirs, if they do acquire an infectious disease, it's often much more difficult to treat because the biological filter will serve as an environmental reservoir. There's also the issue of off-flavor food or food taint. Biological filters produce a number of different metabolites, including malodorous metabolites, specifically geosmin and 2-methyl-isoborneol. These metabolites make the meat unpalatable. Now, it's possible to extract the taint from the meat by bathing the fish in fresh water. However, this takes a lot of time and energy. Now, the goal of the recirculating system is to recreate the natural cycles in an artificial setting. This is done through the use of a number of filters and gadgets. One of the filters used is a mechanical filter, which is essentially a sieve. It's porous material like a sponge, with varying degrees of porosity, from coarse to fine. Now, the point of the mechanical filter is to capture suspended particles in order to keep the water clean. Suspended particles can include feces, waste feed, and plant debris. The mechanical filter must be cleaned or exchanged periodically, otherwise the particulates embedded within will break apart and re-enter circulation. Once they're broken down into smaller pieces, they're a lot harder to filter out. The next type of filter is the chemical filter. Now, there are different kinds of chemical filters. One such filter is the foam fractionation unit. So with foam fractionation, air is injected into the water column. The hydrophobic molecules will latch onto the air bubbles to try to get away from the water. This will produce rising columns of foam. The contaminants are extracted from the water, and the residue is then removed. So the image to the bottom left is actually a natural phenomenon. On certain beaches where there's a lot of surf and crashing waves, proteins and other hydrophobic molecules dissolved in the water create a foam via this process. Another type of chemical filter is the carbon filter. However, this is only useful when you're dealing with small volumes of water, so it's commonly used in aquariums, but not used in aquaculture. Now, activated carbon is a highly porous material with a large surface area. The filter functions via absorption and adsorption. So absorption is when chemicals and particulates are trapped within the pores. Adsorption is when chemicals bind to the surface of the activated carbon. Eventually, the activated carbon is spent, so the filter has to be changed periodically. Another type of filter is the UV filter. Now, the UV filter kills pathogens that are suspended in the water column by bombarding them with ultraviolet radiation. However, the pathogens may persist in substrates, carriers, and reservoirs. The UV filter will also kill beneficial microorganisms, including nitrifying bacteria. The UV filter also improves water clarity by killing algae suspended in the water column. Now, suspended particles, like organic wastes and silt, can limit UV exposure. Algae filters provide substrate and light for algae to grow. Now, the algae in the algae filter can remove ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, phosphate, and other chemical contaminants. In so doing, it can also prevent other algae from growing, improving water clarity. The cultured algae can then be used to feed fish. Biofilms are a collection of microorganisms that form on wet surfaces. These biofilms can harbor nitrifying bacteria. However, they can also harbor pathogenic species. Biofilters facilitate the nitrogen cycle. They are inert porous materials with a large surface area, providing substrate for nitrifying bacteria to grow. These include Nitrosomonas species, Nitrobacter species, and Nitrospira species, which can convert ammonium to nitrite and nitrate. The fluidized bed filter is a special type of biofilter. It's essentially a canister that's full of sand or other medium. Water is pumped through the canister from below, and the sand is suspended, behaving as a liquid. The suspension allows the water to flow through it freely. Suspended sand also has a large surface area, providing ample substrate for nitrifying bacteria to grow. Heaters regulate water temperature. This is more important in tropical aquariums. Now, there are multiple types of heaters. Examples include the immersible and submersible heater, which is a heater that's placed directly into the tank, and the inline heater, which is connected to the circulation system and heats water as it passes through it. The sump is essentially a spare tank. It's used to increase the volume of the water in the system, because a larger volume has greater stability. The sump can also be used to store aquarium equipment, so that the main tank can be reserved for the fish on display. This is more for aesthetics. Now, it's also important to be aware of all the equipment and test kits that are available to check your water parameters. Such devices include water chemistry test strips, which can check for ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, pH, water hardness, and copper, among other things. You've also got your thermometers, your digital pH meters, your dissolved oxygen sensors, and digital salinity meters,